Professor Wilson is a Director for Social Impact at Swinburne University and a long-time leader in disability inclusive research. Her work has helped shape accessible research methods, and she's a strong advocate for research that's led by and with people with disability. And some of you may know that Erin is also leading Australia's new Disability Employment Centre for Excellence, the Centre for Inclusive Employment, which brings together people with disability, researchers, families, and employers to drive real change. And she's also on our research committee. So if you could please join me in welcoming Erin.
Thanks so much for that. That's a really terrific welcome, and it means I don't have to say much about myself. So that makes me most comfortable, because I am least comfortable when talking about myself. However, I will add that I use the pronouns she, her, and from a visual perspective, I am a non-Indigenous older woman with shoulder-length brown hair, and I'm joining you today from the lands of the Wurundjeri people. I've got a long history in both research and practice, and also knowledge mobilisation. I've worked in universities, in TAFE, in disability services, in community services and other activities in community, both as a practitioner and a researcher. I feel like all of that work has been focused on knowledge mobilisation towards positive social change. So it's my job today to set the scene really and provide a foundation for both agreement and disagreement, I hope, amongst us. At least we're starting from a common starting point. So when I'm using the term knowledge mobilisation today, I'm going to use this funky little symbol just to help visualise what that means. And for me, really, the shorthand is about making use of knowledge and moving knowledge into action, as Mary has been describing. Now, typically, when we think of those things and we think about knowledge, we often think about knowledge products. And some of these are also mobilisation practices. But the things we often think about are the reports, the websites, training, guides, tools, methods for how to do things, webinars, submissions to government. All of these are examples of knowledge products and perhaps also examples of mobilisation practices. But let's give that some more thought today. So one place to start is to think about the gap, if you like, the gap between knowledge making and knowledge use. So as we just indicated, often we think about the knowledge product, how knowledge comes to us. We sometimes think about knowledge users, perhaps not as often as we should. And we don't always think about this gap between them and how we bridge that gap and all the mechanisms and processes that we might use to bridge that gap. So I think one way of helping us think through this process is to sort of reimagine this knowledge journey that we go on when we produce knowledge. And as Mary articulated, there's lots of different types of knowledge production. So we're not just talking about formal research, we're talking about consultations in community and getting together and working on something together to understand it better. So typically, when we start on any of those processes, but very much on the research process, we try and start with a question, with something we want to know. What's the question we want to answer? What is it that we want to know? Typically, then we move to thinking about, well, what do we already know about this topic? Because, of course, there's a lot of knowledge in the world. So we need to understand what answers are already available out there. And then having understood that, then we've got to work out, well, what's the gap then? What's the thing now that we best need to know or most need to know? And what's the best way to find that out? Hopefully, we then go and do some investigation, some inquiry, and hopefully do that together with different stakeholders. And along that process, we're constantly thinking about what we're learning in answer to that question that we've had at the beginning. At some point, we bring a formal analysis lens to this process, and we're really trying to more rigorously think through what have we actually learned that answered our question. And then the very key aspect to this, and something that I try and hold on to in all of my work, is what does this mean we do? So we've done the analysis, we've found out some answers, but what do we do with that? What does it mean? What does it now mean we do? How do we use that knowledge? So I really like that question and hang on to that a lot. And I think that really is often where we think knowledge mobilisation happens, where the rubber hits the road. But we can actually also see knowledge mobilisation happening at each of these aspects of the knowledge journey, if you like. Even when we're starting to think about what is the question we're trying to answer here, we're drawing on the knowledge we and others have, thinking about, well, what is the question? Which of these questions should we focus on? And similarly, as we go through the other steps, at each point, we're drawing through knowledge that we already know, and we're mobilising that in the service of the next step of making more knowledge and using that knowledge. So I want to make a sort of provocation here that in fact, this process of producing knowledge or finding out things, actually on each step of this journey, we are drawing on the knowledge we already have and using it, and there are opportunities for knowledge mobilisation in different ways. So I guess this brings us to our first kind of knowledge mobilisation tip, if you like, is that we really need to have this focus right from the beginning about understanding how you want to use the knowledge at each point along this journey, and who will use it, to do what does it mean we want to do. So this brings us to thinking around the sort of the what, the who and the when of knowledge mobilisation, because all of these things are important. So what will this knowledge be used to do? How will it be used? And who will use it? And when will they use it? And if we can answer these questions, it really helps us in the development of the type of knowledge products and processes that are best suited. So it's a design question, really. So to start thinking through some of those answers, excuse me, got a gravelly throat today. So to start with, what will this knowledge be used to do? So Mary's already outlined that typically we think about using knowledge to inform or change practice. That's a really key one, and to change or inform policy. But of course, we also use knowledge to gain funding and influence investment and justify funding decisions, to make a case for why we need the money and why the money should be continued or extended. And in the practice realm, we also use knowledge to inform the design of what we do, the service delivery or the program delivery, how that should be structured and thought about. We, of course, use it to identify and explain a need or a problem. And the thing that we most often use it in my team at Centre for Social Impact is around thinking about solutions to problems, or what's the usefulness of this knowledge, and what is the solution case. So if we take that sort of set of purposes, if you like, to knowledge use, and then we apply it across this thinking about who will use knowledge. Well, of course, there's many users, and often there's more than one user group in any sort of knowledge production endeavour that we might undertake. And so typically, of course, we're thinking about practitioners and those who deliver services. Policymakers have already been called out. Funders or investors, people who bring the money and resources to the things we want to do, or who make decisions about funding in government. They may be organisational decision makers. Advocates use knowledge all the time in the way they make cases and argue for certain positions. And service users also use knowledge, although we don't often think of them in terms of many of our knowledge production use cases, if you like. They're often left out of the picture. And of course, each of those stakeholders will interact with knowledge in a different way. So we have to think about the user and match it to the kind of knowledge product that we want to produce at the end. So when will they use this knowledge? So again, often we think about this when question as using the kind of final answer once we've actually got through that end of the knowledge production process. And that sort of speaks to a kind of point in time use. We get to the end, we have a report, we'll use it to do something. But often we do also think about using that knowledge in an ongoing way or at repeated time points. And from that earlier discussion I had around the knowledge journey, we can also start to apply knowledge at all points on that journey. So we don't have to wait to the end case, we can start to apply the knowledge immediately. So I just want to take us through a couple of more concrete examples that we might use as in our discussions, I'm sure you've got many of your own. They're not necessarily best cases. They're just examples that might resonate with you. So this is an example, again, from the Centre for Social Impact. It's called the WISE Ability Model, or the Work Integration Social Enterprise Ability Model. And this is really an example of an action research process. So you would expect in an action research process that we would be using knowledge from the start and applying it and building on it as we go. And indeed, that is part of how this occurred. So in this instance, we actually started with existing knowledge. There was already a model that existed in the social enterprise space, and we wanted to bring that to a problem which was really around the transformation of Australian disability enterprises, really evolving based on the provocations and vision of the Disability Royal Commission. So we had a model and we had a problem, and we brought those two things together, and already we have a sense of knowledge mobilisation right in that moment. So we used that existing model. We worked with ADE staff, or Australian Disability Enterprise staff, to learn and think about that context. And by having that model, it helped both the staff and also the researchers see that context in new ways. Then we used the model to test it out in practice to try and drive practice change. And that learning by testing enabled us to see the data and create new models. And as we went, we built an entirely new model out of this set of information. And typically, as often happens in these projects, we wanted to extend it. So we wrote the report around what were we learning and what did we find, but also developed a training guide. So over time, as this has gone on, and it's been quite an iterative process over many years, we've been able to use this set of knowledge to influence investment in ADE transitions. So funders have been thinking about what they want to invest in. We've built more training, and we've rolled this out into further use across service providers and practitioners so we can influence practice. And ideally what we're trying to do here is open up ADEs into more desegregated, inclusive models and moving into open employment. So as I said, that was really an example of action research, but all along the way, we're creating and at the same time mobilising knowledge so that staff are using it, and then later funders and others are using it, and we have expansion out into training and other areas. So I want to give you a more traditional research project now, because to some extent, I want to challenge our assumption that we only use the knowledge at the end. So this is again another case study from Centre for Social Impact. Some years ago, we were commissioned to do a review of the information linkages and capacity building program that many of you will be familiar with from the Department of Social Services. So typically, we get a commission from government that says go away and tell us how the ILC, or the information linkages and capacity building grants, are working. We did the typical thing as you do in research, and we went and looked at the literature. We did interviews and surveys with the sector very broadly, so grantees, people who had received the grants, and we looked at the program data that the department had available from those grantees. And that, of course, in turn leads to the typical set of reports, two of which are still publicly available on the DSS website if you're interested. And then, of course, DSS got us to do some presentations across jurisdictions to different government departments. But I think the knowledge mobilisation piece here really was, whilst it was the reports and the presentations, the more powerful piece of knowledge mobilisation here was actually through the regular meetings with department personnel. So all along that project, we met very, very regularly, I think it was fortnightly, with department personnel. And in that process, we were sharing early insights from the data. We were making sense of things along the way. It was a kind of rapid results process. We were constantly bringing these results to the discussion. And we were sharing through that the logic that was emerging. And what's important about this, I think, is that it does address some of the evidence around when do policymakers use evidence? And one of the answers to that is they use it when they need it and if they have access to it. So the problem with that is when we're developing our knowledge is we can often be out of sync. We might develop it at a time, it's important, it's useful, but It's not when necessarily policymakers need it. So what happened here in this process, just through their engagement in thinking and hearing and engaging with the information and knowledge along the way, was I think that they embedded that knowledge into their own mental maps, which meant that it was available to them from their own brains when they needed it. They had been brought on the journey of acquiring that knowledge and had it available to them internally, which was a really interesting process. So the second tip there is that the process of knowledge creation itself can also be a mechanism of knowledge mobilisation if we think about it like that. So to finish off, I just want to finish off two slides. One is thinking through what are the barriers to effective knowledge mobilisation, and then thinking through what we need to do about that. So first of all, I think it's pretty evident that we don't really think about how the knowledge will be used right from the beginning, or not very often. Sometimes, even when we do think about it, those that we intend to use it have no intention of actually using the knowledge. And sometimes we are commissioned to do research where the commissioning party really probably isn't invested in using that knowledge that we're about to produce. There is always an overemphasis on product, this knowledge product, the report, or whatever it is at the end, and very little on the process of knowledge production or research or finding out about things and thinking about how that may be a knowledge mobilisation technique. Often the right who, the actors or the users of who's going to use knowledge, they're missing in the whole equation. We're not thinking about them, and they're certainly not in the room. There's a lack of attention to time frame about how long will it take for knowledge to be used or embedded. This sort of notion that we develop a report, somehow it'll get picked up and used, and that's the end of the story. Well, how long does all this process take before people really engage with something and can use it? We certainly don't ever cost or fund knowledge mobilisation. It's very rare. I think the NDRP, or the National Disability Research Partnership, is really trying to attend to that now. And we have a lack of understanding overall about the evidence for how to design effective knowledge mobilisation for all of those different user groups that we talked about, and in all of those different scenarios of use. So what are the missing ingredients, just to finalise and finish off? I think the key one is intentionality of all parties about knowledge use. So what will we do with it? A very intentional front ending of this question. So that goes to the second ingredient, which is this effective early design of knowledge mobilisation, and including the target knowledge users in that thinking right from the beginning about how will this knowledge be used. It's a question we often ask of those who commission our research right at the start. We need access to evidence about knowledge mobilisation design. There's evidence there. There's a lot of evidence in different fields: implementation, science, knowledge translation, and engagement, all sorts of fields, but it's not very accessible to us. So I think we need to have better translation of that evidence for different audiences and purposes. And we need sufficient resources and timeframes for that mobilisation process and make those visible. They're not visible at the moment. But I guess the provocation I'll leave you with is, you know, all of this, in some ways, it is quite complicated. We do need more of these ingredients in the mix. So what can we do in the meantime? I think we need to be pragmatic. And at each point, we need to think, well, what is it that we can do? What's the most important thing that we can do in terms of enabling knowledge use and knowledge users here? Which of these things can we do well, given the circumstances and resources we've got available to us? So just be a bit pragmatic in answering some of these questions. So I'll leave it there for today. I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you for inviting me.